The webinar has started. Okay, and we are loading the room. I see those numbers going up. We're going to give just a second for the room to load, and then we're going to get started. Good afternoon and good third Thursday. Welcome to ELC Talks through an Equity Lens, brought to you by the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade and Monroe County. And with that, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Avelio Torres, our president and CEO.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here this afternoon with all of you. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a discussion today with a great panel. I think you're going to enjoy the discussion. When we have these cafes, we are all trying to learn together, trying to understand how we can do better for children. The topic today addresses specifically, how bullying and body shaming, and even when it's well intended. We were talking a little bit earlier about, comments like, don't eat this or don't eat that because you're already too fat. It's maybe sometimes seen as an innocent comment, but it really impacts children. How does that impact the child's self-esteem, their ability to learn, and just the way they feel about themselves? So we had a quote on the flyer from, we know her as Honey Boo Boo, right? And the quote I thought was important. She's taken a lot of body shaming, right? Because of the shape of her body, and she's a child. She was a child when she started that program, and people were really mean to her, particularly on social media. And that really does impact a child's psyche and the way they feel, and it impacts them until adulthood. And I think we have so many participants today because everyone can relate to this topic in one way or another. So I'm very happy that we're going to have this discussion today. And again, we're all just trying to learn together. There's not going to be anything, I don't think, revolutionary, but it's really about gaining a better understanding and seeing how we can work with parents and we can work with teachers to create a better environment and better opportunities for children. And we can all do that together as a community and as a group that I know really cares about the children that we are raising in this country. So thank you all, and thank you so much to our panelists. We really are looking forward to this discussion. So take it away, Pam.
Thank you, Avelio. My name is Pamela Hollingsworth, and my pronouns are she, hers. ELC Talks is coming to you today in sign language, American Sign Language, as well as in Spanish and in English. And I'm going to pause here so that you can receive directions for accessing our live translation feature. Adelina?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually. If you want to listen to this ELC Talks in Spanish, just click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. Si usted quisiera escuchar en nuestro ELC Talks en el día de hoy en español, por favor haga clic en el botón de interpretación y seleccione el idioma español. Y para escuchar solamente la versión en español, puede hacer clic en Mute Original Audio o hacer silencio al audio original. Ms. Pam, back to you.
Thank you, Adelina. And please remember, participants, we want to hear from you during the course of today's talk. That said, we can respond most effectively if you use the chat feature for comments and observations, and if you use the Q&A feature for questions for our panelists. And we have team members who will be monitoring both the chat boxes as well as the Q&A, because very quickly we'll be moving into a general discussion. We begin today with a land recognition, and I'd like to take a moment to elevate the Tequesta, Misosuki, and Seminole people, the indigenous people who are the original owners of the land that I am speaking to you from today. So a brief moment of silence, please. Thank you. Now let's talk. Singer-songwriter Christina Aguilera begins her song Beautiful with 4 small and powerful words. Don't look at me. And she's not alone. Research suggests that preschool and elementary age children are more dissatisfied with their bodies now than ever before, and that girls as young as 3 already perceive heaviness as bad and thinness as good. Some studies show that more than 1/3 of 5-year-old girls restrict their eating in order to stay thin. The 2019 poll conducted by Weight Watchers found that almost half of adults have been body shamed because of their weight, hair, or even the size of their feet. And that same survey, which included some 2,000 adults, reported that 56% of adults said someone had made an unpleasant comment about their appearance within the last year, with 1 in 10 saying they had been criticized for their looks in the past week. And finally, in this survey, weight was the most common target for body shaming, with 6 in 10 of those respondents saying they have had comments made about their size. I invite you to think Lizzo. There are so many layers to this conversation. Root causes lie in our culture, in our communities, inequity inside of our food systems, pop culture, social media, the list goes on. And in today's ELC talks, we are going to attempt to lift the veil on body image and body shaming, to reveal some of its root causes, to explore the negativity and its impact on children, young adults, and what we as adults, family members, teachers, professionals, and as a community can do about it. Our first panelist today is Dr. Lana P. Gordon, Chief of Adolescent Medicine of Nemours Children's Hospital in Orlando, Florida. And before I turn the virtual mic over to Dr. Gordon, I will let you know that she received her Doctor of Pharmacy from Florida A&M University and her Doctor of Medicine from Orsani College of Medicine at University of South Florida. She is board certified in pediatrics, adolescent medicine, and obesity medicine. Dr. Gordon, you're on.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for joining. I think, when we think about starting and talking about obesity and body shaming, I think we have to take a look at where the pendulum has swung over the years. So one of the first places that we thought about was, we really recognized that weight may be a contributor to several medical concerns. And we became really intent on trying to correct that. And that was an overall positive thing. But unfortunately, we have gotten to a section now where that became the main focus of medical visits. And so I was actually going to hope that we can transition to my slides. And, I wanted to kind of point out from there that, weight-based stigma starts in 2 places. It starts in the home and it starts in the medical profession. So most young people, one of the things that they first point out is that, they feel weight-based discrimination first and foremost in their medical community. And that is not something that people just feel. That is actually something that people experience. So when surveyed, about 2/3 of healthcare professionals, looking at both doctors and nurses, have reported that they have bias towards patients who live in a particular body. That bias can include feeling less comfortable in caring for those patients, or feeling that their medical concerns are directly related to those patients. Additionally, the only place that patients experience more bias than at home is in the healthcare community. So I have to, as a doctor, start off by saying that I have to acknowledge the role and the harm that my profession may play in helping contribute to this. And so we know that the only way that we can solve the weight-based problem is to stop making weight a problem. We have to stop judging ourselves and others by our size, because weight is not a measure of attractiveness, moral character, or health. And that actually comes from the author, Linda Bacon, who's the author of the book, Health at Every Size. Health at Every Size is a book, but it is also a philosophy and how we should be thinking about weight, lifestyle, and the management of both of those things. And I highly encourage every parent or adolescent in the audience to consider reading this book. It will revolutionize the way that you think about the choices you make for your body. Next slide. So this kind of just summarizes the data we had kind of talked about before. Again, talking about the 52% of patients report having been stigmatized, 69% of patients report physicians, and 24% of nurses agree that they are repulsed by patients in larger bodies. And physicians are the second highest source of weight bias, only behind family members. Next slide. So a lot of people wonder, do I have weight-based bias? So, how do I know if I have weight-based bias? So Harvard has created a set of very validated tests called the implicit association test. The link is on here, and or you can just type it into Google. I would encourage you to do that, because the same way that you can have bias in gender or bias in race or bias in religious preference or sexual orientation preference, you can also have bias associated with how you view people in various bodies. And this illustration just shows us that all of the things we may think about bodies are related, can come in any body. So healthy bodies can look a variety of ways. Unhealthy bodies can look a variety of ways. Eating disordered bodies can look a variety of ways. Confident bodies can look a variety of ways, active bodies, and so forth. So really trying to assess how people behave or what their lifestyle looks like by looking at the external features is just not something that's valid. Next slide. So throughout this, you'll kind of see obesity used in quotes. And the reason why is that obesity is a language that we've used that puts a pathology around people in larger bodies. That may not actually, in fact, be true. Indeed, there is an ideal weight for each individual, but it is not that there is an ideal weight for all of society. And so instead of saying obesity when referring to people who are in larger bodies, it is better to say an individual who's in a larger body, a larger bodied individual, or an individual with a higher weight body. Next slide. So I mentioned, at the beginning, health at every size, and encouraged you all to look into that. So what is health at every size? And I think it's helpful to first think of what health at every size is not. Next slide. So a lot of times people think that health at every size means that you don't have to pursue any kind of healthy lifestyles. So health at every size is not against science. It's not against eating well. It's not that you are healthy at every single size. So it does not mean that we should not talk about weight in the context of medical conditions. It doesn't mean that we're anti people changing their weight or making changes to their body that they want to. And health at every size is actually not a new concept. It's been around actually for about 4 decades. What health at every size is, however, is a way that we recognize and acknowledge the social framework that has marginalized people in larger bodies. It is a way that we acknowledge that all people are worthy to pursue health. And it's the fact that we can support the movement of all bodies. All bodies are good, all bodies deserve to be honored, and all bodies deserve to be respected. And in the process of respecting your body, it's the recognition that you can take care of your body, and they should be cared for by all health professionals. Everybody has the autonomy to make decisions about their body, and that includes decisions on whether they would like to alter their weight. Next slide. So when we think about the health at every size principles, there are 5 of them: weight inclusivity, health enhancement, respectful care, eating for well-being, and life enhancing movement. So the first one is weight inclusivity. Next slide. And that's the idea that we recognize that every single person has bodies that come in different shapes and sizes, and we reject the idea that specific weights or sizes are associated with pathology. Next slide. Health enhancement is the idea that we need to support health policies and structural changes that promote human well-being, and that human well-being includes physical, economic, social, spiritual, emotional, and other needs. Next slide. The idea that everybody is deserving of respectful care. And so the same way that we should be seeking not to discriminate based on socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, or any other identity, that weight discrimination is an identity that we should also not be stigmatizing based on. Eating for well-being. So the idea that food is the nourishment that allows our body to do all the tasks that it does every day, and that we should be attuning ourselves to the hunger and satiety cues. And then last slide. Life enhancing movement. So the idea that we should allow people of all sizes and abilities to move and engage in the type of movement that brings them joy and to the degree and ability that they choose. And at this juncture, I'm going to actually pass this mic over to Ms. Millie Maldonado, who is a licensed mental health counselor, to continue talking about this topic.
Dr. Gordon, can I ask you a quick question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so how do you balance, because if we accept that, of course, body shapes and sizes come in all, there are different body types. How do you balance when you are dealing with a patient and counseling them on healthy eating and appropriate body weight? How do you do that without making them feel ashamed or that they're too overweight, and that is just a matter of it's a discussion about their health, not a discussion necessarily about their body, which I guess it goes hand in hand. But how is that addressed from the medical profession?
So I start off with a conversation of why exactly do we need health? So we need health to allow us to do the things that are important to us every day. And so I actually start the discussion from a place of what is it in your life that you would like to do more of and you feel like you can't do? And then we use that as the centering point to then talk about the lifestyle changes. So sometimes people come and see me and they think that they're going to be talking about weight, and the place we start is sleep. The place we start is their mood. Because if you don't get enough sleep at night, then you won't make good health choices throughout the day. You won't exercise. You won't choose what we would call healthier items or more nutrient dense items to eat. And so we know that if people are getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night, it becomes impossible to make any kind of weight change to their body. And so, so I spend a lot of time actually starting at things that people don't traditionally think of as being part of the nutrition or obesity talk, because you must work on those foundational things before you can make the other changes. And so that's what I would say with that.
That's great advice. Thank you. I'll start trying to sleep more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. That was great information. Yes, so I'm glad to be here joining this discussion and adding a little bit of the mental health perspective that is very important when we are considering talking about how weight and shaming children for their weight or their image can impact their mental health. So I am a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida and also a qualified supervisor for mental health interns. And I'm the executive director of the Trauma Resolution Center. The Trauma Resolution Center is a community mental health agency that provides trauma-informed counseling to residents here in Miami-Dade. And continuing with the conversation on the impact of children's mental health when they experience body shame and image change and shame, I want to start with a little bit of self-disclosure in order to bring you into maybe seeing it from the lens of a child. I remember being around 4 years old and I had freckles. And until that memory, I don't remember even seeing myself as different. It wasn't until I began to be called from my own family members a pecosa, which Spanish means freckled face. And I then started looking at myself different. But it wasn't until I started hearing comments from adults making jokes about how I looked. And one of the comments that I always remember is an adult telling my mother that she did not dry my face and therefore I had mold. Imagine a 4 or 5-year-old hearing this conversation from an adult. Then I really started looking at my face. Not only did I look at my face, but I saw myself not pretty and I didn't see myself like the other children in school. And that's when I consider low self-esteem started. The same way that we can body shame children for their weight, also their image, it is not okay. It is not okay to tell a child that either too skinny, too fat, too blonde, too short. That is not the conversation that we want to start with our children. So what is it that implements? Believe it or not, that body shaming actually affects children's self-esteem. And also it impacts their school activities. A child that does not feel good with his or herself tends to actually isolate themselves from school or not socialize. And on the other hand, maybe start bullying other children because they model the behavior of us, the adults, because we are their role models. So when we think about the option of do as I say or not as I do, really think about, are children really understanding that? Children are looking at parents, caregivers, educators, are their role models. They are their blueprint of how they're going to see the world. So I tell parents, remember the conversation and what we are projecting on our children, and also how we talk about our own bodies and how we look in front of our children. Believe it or not, they are listening, and then they are modeling the behavior. And if a child hears a parent or an adult talk about negative about their bodies, then they're going to look at themselves and they're going to start thinking also negative about their bodies. So definitely thinking about that, being grounded when we are with our children and really paying attention to the conversations. I don't remember how my mom reacted to this humorous joke. And I don't think that the person did it in a bad manner. They were just trying to be funny, but that really changed the way that I saw myself for many years. So really pay attention. And how do we speak to our children? How do we encourage self-esteem to our children? How do we stop the body shaming? It starts with us first. It starts with talking nice and positive about ourselves and our children. Encourage them to even do positive affirmations. What is positive affirmations? Pretty much like looking at yourself in the mirror and saying something nice about yourself. And it doesn't have to be how you look. And also encourage them to really talk about how they're feeling and listen to them. As Oprah Winfrey says in her book of What Happened to You, those children that are heard and seen feel better about themselves. So with that, I will pass it on to Ms. Georgia.
Can I ask a question again before we move on to Ms. Georgia?
Yes.
What do you say that, we see this sometimes in the Hispanic community, where someone will say, well, you need to develop a thick skin, just toughen up, because you won't be able to go through life unless you become tougher, and you need to let all these comments just slide off. What do you say about that? Because I know that that doesn't make anything go away. And sometimes people think that is the solution, right? It's just, don't let it bother you. But it does bother kids in particular.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I tell parents in conversations and also family members is, well, we need to do better than how we were raised, right? And we need to figure out okay, so you be resilient and you ignore, but how did that impact you? Going back and looking at our childhood and what can we do better? Becoming resilient is not just ignoring. Becoming resilient is actually having somebody to actually listen to you. And if a child says, Mom, they're bullying me at school, tell me about it and validate their experience. Validate that it did hurt them. I think that's really important. And that's a conversation that I have, especially with a lot of different cultures and parents. Just the same way that we can talk about the way that we were punished, is we're doing better. We need to do better. So I do talk to parents about that and educating yourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Georgia Thompson. I'm a Senior Program and Policy Analyst with Nemours Children's Health in their National Office of Policy and Prevention, where my work focuses on improving health outcomes for young children. And I'm going to bring early childhood into the conversation and talk a little bit about a holistic and equitable approach to food security in early childhood. Often, we have to consider and think of the fact that, obesity is a part of our world, often because of a combination of different factors that includes our environment, our communities, state systems, and what resources are available to us. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So as we know, the first 5 years of a child's life are a critical period for growth and development, and that impacts a child's future success. During this time, young children are growing rapidly in 4 major domains of development: physical, cognitive, social, emotional, and language. These domains are interdependent. So our approach in early childhood and early care and education should be a holistic approach that promotes children's acquisition of a variety of different skills. Our goal here is to support the whole child. So we don't just focus on the cognitive, physical, and language skills, but also on social emotional development, because this is a period in children's lives where they're starting to learn who they are. They're developing a sense of self. And so that's what kind of brings another angle into this conversation, because we're talking about how children see themselves, their body image. And so at a very young age, between, once they reach preschool age, they're starting to develop and understand who they are, and who they are in reference to the world and how they interact with other children, as well as the significant caregivers in their lives. So when we're talking about supporting that whole child, we have to take all those things into account. Furthermore, as we work to support children's growth and development, we have to recognize that children come from families. Those families are part of communities that are in states that make decisions that can impact a family's livelihood. So we have to think about all of this in our approach to the whole child. So I'm going to switch to talk a little bit more about food and food access. And in talking about that, we have to think about how we at different levels, family, community, state, how can we make it so children and families have access to food and resources so that they can make those healthier choices. So we in early childhood, we talk about attachment, secure attachment, and that's secure, that word, it refers to, a level of responsiveness and consistency so that a child knows what to expect. They know that they can depend on that significant caregiver in their life to meet their needs. And that really becomes the foundation of their trust of that caregiver. So when we're talking about secure and security, unfortunately, we have to recognize that many children and families in this country are struggling to meet certain levels of security when it comes to food, to their home, safety, healthcare, high quality education, etc. So you can see, some of the statistics here on the slides. Across the country, there are 38 million Americans that have lived in households that have struggled with food insecurity. 1 in 7 households with children can't afford to buy enough food for their families. And then we take it a step further and break it down and look at race and ethnicity. And then we see that 22% of Black and 17% of Latinx households are disproportionately impacted by food security. And so these rates were triple and double the rates of white households in 2020. And then even further, we're also seeing struggles with food hunger compounded in households that are located in rural areas compared to those in metro areas as well. Next slide, please. So we were already in the midst of inequitable access to food and resources, which you might consider is its own pandemic. And then COVID-19 enters the chat. So throughout COVID-19, we realized that many children and families were relying on ECE programs and schools for access to nutritious meals. And when those schools closed, their food supply was cut off. So children were no longer had access to federal food programs and school food programs that provided them with regular meals. So then our country realized yet another important role of early care and education, that we're supporting food security. And in addition to that, we've long known that ECE supports parents and caregivers' ability to work outside the home and provide an income to their families. But all of these things were impacted by COVID-19. So then we saw our administration move very quickly to prioritize and allocate funding to support childcare that can, again, lean back and lean on and support certain areas such as food security. And we'll come back to that later. Next slide, please. So let's talk about, again, what we can do at these different levels to support positive body image, to support healthy choices at these different levels. As Dr. Gordon mentioned, it starts in the home. So we want to recognize there are many right ways to healthier habits. Parents and caregivers, we need to model those healthy habits, make it a part of our daily routine, watch our words. It includes how we talk about ourselves, like Millie said, that self-talk is important because we're models to children. Talk, read, and sing about healthy choices. Connect with other parents and caregivers, and share our expertise with ECE programs, with community leaders and other members and residents. Next slide, please. And ECE programs, what can you do? You can offer supplemental curriculum that promotes healthy practices and character development, so how children interact and talk to one another. You can apply for and identify grants that support maybe you offering a community garden, or supports for breastfeeding that also help with obesity prevention. Offer family engagement opportunities, support staff wellness so that the staff can model healthy behaviors to children as well. And then ECE programs should connect with their local CCR&R agencies so that they can know what opportunities there are that they can leverage as well. Next slide. And then finally, we want to address the root causes. So let's look to the state level and what state agencies can do to support healthy choices and healthy practices for families. They can collect and analyze data so they can identify those barriers, and looking at some of those root causes and disaggregating the data, looking at breakouts for race, ethnicity, what types of communities they're located in. They can also align their ECE initiatives at the state level, such as QRIS, licensing, professional development, so that those standards promote healthy practices at the highest level. And then they can leverage their child care development fund dollars. So that money I mentioned earlier, that can be leveraged, there's my timer, that can be leveraged to offer opportunities and provisions to support healthy practices within programs. And then we want to collaborate and share decision-making power with parents, with providers, and hear from them on how best we can implement strategies to support healthy eating. And of course, review our internal policies as well that can also tell us where we are creating barriers within our own policies and implementing in those different areas. So that about wraps up some of the strategies and suggestions to those different levels. I've also shared some resources here that can be provided at a later time to all of our participants. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Georgia, and to all of our panelists. I see that we do have several questions in the chat, in the Q&A box, as well as several observations in the chat box. I'm going to start by focusing in on something that Dr. Gordon mentioned in her presentation. And from there, Anna, will punt to you to start bringing out questions from the chat box. Dr. Gordon, you mentioned that physicians tended to have a very high incidence of bias toward weight. Could you explain or speak to some of the reasons behind that? Because I would think, and I'm hearkening back to something that Georgia always said: when you know better, you do better. And going back to the source, I'd love to hear some reasons for that. And then we're going to start pulling questions from the chat box.
So I think that a lot of that comes from starting in a place of misinformation. So physicians' goal always is to think about a problem and a solution. And so we tend to use data to try to drive that decision-making. So it gets back to thinking about the measure that we use for obesity, and that measure is called the body mass index, or BMI. So basically that looks at your weight in proportion to your height squared and says, if you're in a particular category, you're a healthy weight. If you're in a particular category, you're overweight. And then if you're above a particular category, that was what was classified as obesity. And then there were categories of obesity. And that was supposed to map onto your risk for cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of death in the United States when we look at adults. The problem with this measure, though, is that it was never intended to be a medical measure. So the measure was actually developed by insurance agents, and it was just based upon people who were buying insurance. And this was at the turn of the 18th to 19th century. So the people who were buying insurance at that point in time were mainly Caucasian men. And so when you think about that, and we think about the diversity of our population, if we're monitoring kind of what is the mean and then what is kind of the standard deviations from that in a group of one particular people, then who are we excluding? Well, we excluded women who we know have higher body fat percentages and need to have higher body fat percentages. We're excluding people of color. Some people of color, so particularly our Asian communities, actually need to have a lower body mass index to maintain that health. And some of our other cultures, people of African heritage, which will include some of the Latinx community, actually need to have body habituses that are larger than what would be considered the mean from that. They tried to reapproach that number But even in the reapproach of that number, they threw out the data of groups that came from areas that were not predominantly Western European. So we used a flawed number to then create these cutoff points. When we now have gone back actually in 2012 to look at what is the BMI that's actually optimal for promoting life, we've actually found that that BMI is supposed to be somewhere between 27 to 32, which actually on our modern BMI table or on our current BMI table maps out to overweight and obese status. So it turns out that the numbers that we're using as our marker point of health isn't accurate, but unfortunately it's still being taught. And so because of that, people then use that number to then talk about weight and lifestyle problems and things that need to be changed, and in turn reflect patients who cannot maintain a weight in that age as being unwilling to adhere to medical treatment because they're thinking of the weight loss as being a part of medical treatment.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Anna, we have a few questions in the chat box, in the Q&A, I see.
We do. We've got a couple. One from our old friend, Jusnelli Martinez, who writes, at what age does a child begin to form an opinion of their bodies?
The floor is open.
So research shows that children within the age of 3 to 4 years old are already even looking at their bodies, their parents' bodies, and comparing.
I would
Thank
say
you.
even more important than that is that at that age, they're actually starting to attribute negative attributes to larger bodies. So when they're, kind of that classic doll study that was done in thinking about colorism, when it's applied also to weight, you see the exact same outcomes in terms of larger bodied dolls being viewed as ugly, as being unkind, as being less attractive.
Thank you. And to both panelists, how does that figure across gender? Or does it?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, I was going to say it doesn't change across gender.
Thank
So,
you.
so in 2021, if you go to a toy store, most dolls are still very, very thin, right? So
Mhm.
we just haven't made a lot of progress in that area. That's the image, right? So it's hard to convince little girls otherwise because that's all they're saying.
Mm.
Not just all the dolls, but all the characters, all the princesses. I mean, it's infiltrated in society.
Yeah.
Do we go on?
Yes, please, Anna.
Sure. This is from another participant. And the question is, during this pandemic, some families are limited with taking young children out to mingle and play with other kids due to the fear of COVID. What do you suggest they can do to meet these kids' social learning aspects?
Right. So one of the suggestions we had even early in the pandemic is actually to create creative play with children. Take time to play with your children and read, and within their own age and understanding, explain what's going on. Also now it's being connected with your child care center and the early schools, early Head Start, and figuring out how you can continue at home, encourage the learning and just social and emotional areas.
One thing
Please, Georgia.
just going to add something I've heard of someone doing is that having a small bubble. So maybe within the neighborhood where the families both understand, their access is restricted to, this, maybe it's these 3 houses on this block and their children there, they may get tested regularly. They're restricting their, socialization otherwise out in the community. So they form this bubble and then their children play together. That's just something I've heard of someone doing, but I know it's very challenging. But I would echo what Millie said also about, staying connected to your ECE programs and receiving suggestions on activities that can be done at home. I know this is a time where the use of screens has probably increased, but we want to continue to monitor that and ensure that we are, still keeping kids physically active as well with different activities that we can do, whether it's between the siblings, a cousin, or someone, within that trusted bubble.
Thank you. Thank you. And speaking of preschools, and to the panelists, do anti-bullying programs work? Are they effective?
Well, it depends on the components of the anti-bullying program. So, anti-bullying programs stretch this very wide range. I think we have to start from a place of acknowledgement that most children who bully were bullied themselves, whether that's that they're bullied in their family structure or they're bullied in school. And so a lot of programs went to kind of this very zero tolerance policy that's very punitive. And unfortunately, the data has shown that those types of policies do not work.
Yes, very true. And to add to that, instead of the anti-bullying, pretty much a trauma-informed lens, right? Where we are asking even those children that are acting out or bullying, finding out what has happened to them, what's going on at home, and creating a support instead of punishing them or isolating them, or again, creating that belief that they're bad. So now they're not good people. Now, if they were being bullied, it actually creates what we call here, and one of the techniques that we use with clients is false indications. So false indications, meaning these statements that they've received, and now even through their behavior, they're again creating this core belief. So again, a trauma-informed care.
Should we go on?
Yes, Anna, please.
This is from Jacqueline Martinez and asks, even when some stores have used bigger size mannequins, they are standout or they stand out and people make comments. Do you believe these mannequins help or hurt the conversation?
I think they help, but more are needed. So I think the challenge is that, even when we think about, how clothing in stores is structured. So plus size clothing, wherever that cutoff point is housed in a separate section of the section. We have separate plus size stores. And instead of just having a clothing section or a clothing store. And so, it's not helpful to put mannequins in some stores and not in other stores, or to have them only, the larger size mannequins in the plus size section, because that's segregating. I saw a really good visual that talked about kind of thinking about inclusion versus integration. And the idea that it was like looking at different colored dots, and it was saying, well, inclusion is when you clump all of the dots of the same color into the larger pool of dots. But integration is when you take those different colored dots and you mix them all together. And so I think that what we haven't really done well as a society in thinking about weight is how do we include all body sizes, as opposed to saying, oh, okay, we want larger bodies to be a part of this, but they're going to be over in this place, which is a more segregating experience.
Sure. We also have a question from Dr. Annabelle Espinosa, and she says, where can we find accurate information and messaging regarding the impact of weight on health? I constantly hear people promote thinner bodies and disordered eating habits under the guise of health. How can we combat this messaging? I understand that weight does not equate to health, but are there examples of health in larger bodies?
So that's where I would encourage the Health at Every Size. So if you go to Health at Every Size just on Google, there's a healthataeverysize.org. And then there's a link from there to a whole compilation of data that goes, that kind of shows, different examples. There's also, if you go to any of the eating disorder websites, so the National Alliance for Eating Disorders, they actually link to articles that talk about how dieting, the cycle of dieting, actually increases eating disordered behavior, and how having eating disordered behavior actually leads to poor cardiac outcomes and inflammatory based diseases. So diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, so forth. There's also a website that I'm blanking on right now, but I can provide to Ms. Hollingsworth to send out to people, that for health professionals, you can actually get patient education sheets on some of the more commonly thought of as obesity related illnesses that really are written from a Health at Every Size lens. So instead of promoting very restrictive eating patterns, instead talk about what you can encourage. I spend a lot of time talking to families about the Mediterranean diet or really Mediterranean eating plan when talking about more weight-based illnesses, because that is the only lifestyle plan that has been shown to be associated with lowering risk of heart disease, PCOS, diabetes, high cholesterol, you name it. And it's much more about adding healthier options to your diet, which then causes you to subtract some that are less healthy. And so, just thinking about just how do you promote body positive nutrition counseling.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the earlier questions talked about larger sized mannequins. That really bubbled up for me. The very prevalent conversation today about the body, and I'm using air quotes here, the body positivity movement. And it really ties in, I think, to Avelio's observation earlier about, toughen up, get resilient. And as we move forward through that movement with varying size models, and of course, the integration issue that Dr. Gordon talked about, we're still struggling along the way. Yet on social media, the pushback is intense. So my question to the panelists is, are we making a difference? How would you describe the body positivity movement? Are we going in the right direction? And if not, how do we do some kind of mid-course correction to get things going the way they should?
When it comes to social media, I always find that there's just this confusion, right? We want to create the body positive image, but then you have individuals commenting negative on what people post. You have these filters that people are using all the time. I mentioned that there's pictures that I see even children where parents are added filters. So what's the conversation there? I think that social media is great in creating information and adding information, but where's that information coming from? So changes, I think, is what we're doing now, conversations with medical doctors, with researchers, with individuals that can bring facts and can give us that information versus what we hear from social media and or other types of sources.
I think that we may need another panel of mannequins, because I wasn't going to bring it up. Pam brought up mannequins. I'm going to bring it up. So I think part of it is conditioning, because when we are going to go to the store and buy something, is we see a mannequin that is fit and the clothes fit nice, and it's like, okay, I'm going to buy those clothes because I'm going to look like that fit mannequin. And then you take it home, maybe it's a different story. But I think it's that conditioning that if we see maybe like an overweight mannequin, we may not be as willing to make the purchase, right? So I think it's marketing and conditioning that. So it's a really interesting, I think, question, and that is just the way our society is right now. And I guess that's really what we're talking about. How do we change that so that we don't always have to feel that way when we're at the store, and people with different body shapes and sizes, they don't always have to look at what they think fits into society or what we have been conditioned to believe. And that's a hard thing to do. And when we go back to the impact on kids, they're starting to see that from a very early age, right? And particularly now with social media, just go to TikTok and you'll see that it's difficult for kids. They have a hard time, and I don't think it's getting any easier. If anything, I think it's getting worse with social media.
Yes.
Some of it is we have to make society and the systems that people interact with look as much like real life as possible. So, I think it's, again, it's not just one store, it's not just one section, it's everything we do. So it's the marketing images, it's the pictures that are in books, it's the books that we choose to read to our children. I'm a big, advocate of reading, as I'm sure all of you all are as well. And so one of the things that I give every, friend of mine when they're having a child is at their baby shower, I give them a book to start their child's library. And I give a book with every single birthday present or Christmas presents, or just whenever I give a present, I always give a book instead of a card. And what I really try hard to do is to make sure that I increase the diversity of the books I give. So I look for books where the hero in there is a child who's in a larger body. I look for books where the hero in the book is a child that is Black, a child that is Latinx, a child that is Asian. And I do that for all of my friends' children, regardless of race, because all children need to see different types of people as a part of their world, and all of people doing different things. But it is hard to find particularly books that show children who are in larger bodies. it is hard to find books of children who are differently abled, because those are two groups where, as we've started to have conversations around diversity in society, we have left these two areas of diversity out of the conversation.
Dr. Gordon, how important is it to have conversations within a family unit about genetics, right? Because genetics have something to do with all of this.
Oh, absolutely. So I have that conversation. So when I'm talking to a family about, a child who really does need to make some food or lifestyle changes in, what they're doing for a health condition. So we have a health condition that really is being impacted by the body size. I talk about the fact that this is a whole family change. So I'm talking about, what does your family structure look like? So does your family need to turn off devices at an earlier time of the day? And that means there's a box in the living room that everybody puts their phone in, an iPad in, and goes off to their separate places. Does your family need to think about outdoor activities? So it's not just this child needs to go and run outside for 30 minutes every day. So the family's going to go on a bike ride. And what day are you all going to go on a bike ride on? The family's going to go swimming, and how many Saturdays are you going to go swimming? And I make the family actually, we sit down, we figure it out. I put it on their after visit summary so that when you leave, the same way that it says here, is the prescription your doctor prescribed you. Well, here are the instructions your doctor gave you. Our family is going to ride our bike for 30 minutes on Wednesday and Friday after school at 5:30. Our family is going to go to the pool on Saturday from 10 to 12. So that way it's just as serious as, the prescription that I said for antibiotics, take 3 times a day for 7 days.
Last question, I promise, but is that common now in the medical community? Is that something that is being taught in medical school, or is that uncommon?
So I think it's getting more common. It was not taught to me in medical school, and I do have some gray hair tucked in there, but probably not as much as the typical doctor. But I do teach medical students, and that is part of what I teach them. I do think that there are some wonderful examples of hospital systems that are starting to incorporate these kinds of things through geo mapping, so they can look at the family's address and say, oh, your doctor said you need to exercise more. Here are some free exercise programs and things of that nature. And so I do believe it is becoming more common. I think Georgia can probably speak to some of the policy things that we've been working on as an organization in that realm, but I do think it is becoming more common, but I don't think we're all the way there yet.
Georgia, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I can't speak to specific policies, but I know that there are so many opportunities right now that we can take advantage of. I mentioned, we saw, $39 billion for childcare, and 24 billion of that is for stabilization of childcare. And within that, we can start to, our ECE systems and our ECE programs can take advantage of certain provisions that can help support healthy eating. But it does go back to kind of what Dr. Gordon, what Millie alluded to earlier. It starts at home. And so when we were having the conversation about the mannequins, all I thought about was representation, and how seeing, different bodies, different abilities, different backgrounds, ethnicities, all that displays for children is representation of how our world is changing these days. I was looking at a few recent articles about what we've already seen come out of the 2020 census in terms of how our world is changing in terms of diversity, ethnicity, race, and makeup. And so all of these things impact the way or the lens through which we should be looking at different things like, obesity and obesity prevention, positive body image. We should think about all of these different variables that impact us, because I think for a long time we've been looking at things one way or one or two ways that really haven't been getting us far, and we haven't been really seeing the type of data points or research that we can really leverage to really see what are the root causes of some of these issues and what are some really sustainable changes that we can make to really start to see positive growth and positive images. And on another note, I wanted to share a resource that I'm becoming more familiar with, because I know Millie was talking about trauma-informed care, and one of our partners is Tufts Medical Center, and they have this concept called HOPE, which is healthy outcomes from positive experiences. And I know a lot of times when kids are young, we think about, what are the adverse childhood experiences that they're battling with that we need to be cognizant of. And HOPE really promotes looking at how can we leverage the positive experiences, how can we hone in on those to promote healthy outcomes for children. And that's in terms of, healthy eating, healthy weight and practices. but also healthy social and emotional development. So I just wanted to share that one and highlight that as well, because I know a lot of times we're thinking of, all the things that we're battling and that we're up against, but we can really highlight the positive experiences and lift up some of those in order to see some real healthy change and sustainable
Thank you.
outcomes.
Thank you, Georgia. Claudia or Adelina, let's pull up our beautiful slide. And Millie, would you like to say a few words as we bring our session to an end? You're muted.
This was great conversation. And even through here, I've learned also just so much. So I'm really thankful. And just to remind everyone that we were once children. So the same way that we are saying, stop body, teach our children how to love ourselves, stop body shaming others. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? So just keeping up with what we are teaching our children and really model that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Avelio, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to you as we enter our last 5 minutes today.
Yeah, so I think we could have gone another hour easily. Thank you so much for the panelists. This has been a great discussion. I wish we had an hour with each of you to continue this conversation. Millie touched on trauma-informed care. Our next cafe, we're going to focus on trauma-informed care and not the typical, the child was abused and has a black eye, now it's trauma. More of the more subtle trauma that kids are suffering. We spoke about some of that today, but we're going to try to focus on that at our next panel. So just wanted to plug our next panel. I think is going to be an important discussion about what we can do as adults and caregivers and professionals to help kids that have suffered trauma that all of us know we carry into adulthood, right? We may forget for a few years, put it behind, but it resurfaces at some point in adulthood. So we're gonna have a good conversation about that also at our next panel. So thank you, panelists. Pam, any last words?
Thank you, Avelio. And I do see a couple of statements in the chat box about wanting to see the session again. If I could have one of the PDI staff, Claudia, if you haven't done so already, please put the link to our Professional Development Institute website in the chat box, and you will see on our homepage by tomorrow morning. This session will be posted along with several other past ELC Talks sessions that we invite you to view. Let's pull up our final slide. Thank you, Claudia. And hold on, just keep it up there. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to invite any of you that can hold out for 3-4 minutes because we do have a formal outro for you. But as always, we want to gently remind you that after today, you can choose to look away, but you cannot say that you did not know. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, and I invite you to take a few minutes to listen and to contemplate on the lyrics to Beautiful by Christina Aguilera. And if you want to listen to it on your way home, just take out your phone and point it at the QR code in the upper right-hand portion of the screen. You can feel free to darken your screens and just listen. And with that, we will bid you goodbye, and we'll see you next month. All right.
Every day is so wonderful, and suddenly it's hard to breathe. Now and then I get insecure from all the pain. I'm so ashamed. I am beautiful, no matter what they say. Words can't bring me down. Don't you bring me down today.
On behalf of the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade Monroe. Let's cut that tape. And I'll repeat on
Beautiful
behalf of, yes, indeed. And on behalf of the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade and Monroe County, and from our end of the internet to yours, wishing you a beautiful day and namaste, and stay positive. Thank you. Millie, Georgia, thank you so much.